A fight at the Olympics for the first time since 1998? Man, this Canadian team does everything.
Gold medal, let's go!
Welcome back to the fly. We're previewing the predicting, recapping World Junior Championships, our Men's World Championships, the Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. Expect the unexpected.
Absolute abomination of the Canadian junior national team.
I have a couple extra words I want to use in that one. And it's Freebird. Freebird, Freebird, Freebird. Of course, the Olympics are just around the corner. I'm going to coin it the rivalry day.
World Junior history!
Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly. Hello everyone, welcome back to On the Fly. It's here recapping Day 5 of the Men's Olympic Hockey event happening in Milano and Cortina, Italy. So we'll hop into today, starting with the scores from today's game, starting with a 4-3 victory in overtime for Switzerland over the Czechs. Now in this game, it was one of those games coming in, a very important one for both sides. You think to the Swiss, if they can win the game, they end up second spot in Group A. Same thing with the Czechs. The loser becomes the third spot in the group. And so lots to play for, especially in the grand scheme of the standings, where you want to finish higher, you want to avoid having to play the tougher teams at this tournament. And for the Czechs today and for the Swiss, they came out hot right out of the gate. And we saw that kind of momentum and that energy boil over at some points in this one. And for the Czechs, today was a very well-played game. Unfortunately for them, just didn't quite get the bounces. And whether it was a late goaltender interference call or whether it be, the extra players on the ice, I do think that this Czech team can still walk away from this game being content with it. Yes, you would have liked the win. Yes, you would have liked, obviously, not having to go against Canada if you do end up winning your qualifying round and get to that quarterfinal. But at the same time, it's still a good game for this Czech squad that they're building momentum. They played a decent one today against the Swiss. They're going to try and continue that into their qualification round game against the Danes. And then all of a sudden that question mark does become, how far can the Czechs go? Can they pull off one last big upset at this tournament and take out Canada in the eventual quarterfinal? With the Czechs, you really never know because they do have a decent squad this year, the kind of talent that could potentially pull off the upset, and now it's just a matter of execution. For the Swiss today, I thought they played a really good game, and coming into the game, losing some key players to injury, not playing in this one, you saw that kind of impact hit them relatively hard, but at the same time, you also saw some of their key players step up. Guys like Sven Andrighetto, who once again played with Dennis Malgin, who's now replaced Kevin Fiala. And so I think for a guy like Andrighetto, that's what you need, is you need guys who are going to step up into that next man up mentality. And for the Swiss, that's where I thought that this team definitely shows a little bit of that character side, that there's a reason why they've been back-to-back silver medalists at the Men's World Championship these last few years. And they showed it today, and they did pick up a big 4-3 victory. They will take the second spot in Group A. The Czechs will finish in the third spot, a 4-3 overtime victory for Switzerland over the Czechs in the opening game. And then to the second game of the day between Canada and France. And this game, yes, the score was 10-2. It's hard to talk much more about this game than it being 10-2, the final score, but what I'd say is you look to some of the more minor parts of this game, and for the Canadians, it was a lot of heart. It was one of those games that I'd say they did take a lot of pride in, but at the same time, there were also some key mistakes that got punished by the French a little bit. We saw, of course, the goaltending was one for me that I'd say was a bit of a red flag, with Binnington not having his best game and being the reason why both goals ended up getting let in. I do think that could potentially be a reason why you end up going to a guy like Logan Thompson, or maybe even Darcy Kemper, although I think Thompson is the obvious guy next up in line. For Canada, you need your goaltending to be at its best as you head into the knockout stages, because your path to the gold medal game, which is what they have their sights set on, is extremely tough. You're likely going to have to go through the Czechs, then it's going to be probably the Finns, unless there's an upset somewhere in there as well, and then potentially the U.S. or the Swedes coming, or probably the U.S., to be quite frank with you. It'll probably be that U.S. team in the gold medal, and you're going to need your goaltending to be at its best, because without it, you're not going to go very far. But credit to Canada so far. They found that goaltending. For France today, it was a bit less of a solid game, I'd say. And obviously you go up against Canada, you're looking for those moments, and they had some moments in this game, but just outclassed today by a better team. 10-2 victory for Canada over France. Then to the third game of the day between Denmark and Latvia, and Denmark did take this one 4-2, your final. But in this game, it was a bit of a confusing narrative where, yes, the final score 4-2, you can chalk it up there, but you look at this game, and for the Danes, they started red hot, and credit to them for getting out to the early lead. They jump out to a 3-0 lead. And then from that point on, it was all Latvia. And the better that Latvia continued to play better and better as this game went onward. But unfortunately, they just kind of ran out of time. And it's part of the joys of being a team at this tournament that's very defensively minded, is that when you get into those must-score situations, it becomes a little bit more tough. And credit to the Danes, they played fairly well defensively. I wouldn't say they played great. They did allow quite a few chances. But for Latvia, they just didn't have that one finisher that could have very well changed the outcome of this game. The Danes had the empty net at the end. And then from there, the tiebreakers, which we'll talk about in a second, became that came much more into question. And once again, your final here, a 4-2 win for Denmark over Latvia. Denmark will finish in the third spot over in Group C. Latvia will finish in the fourth spot. The last game of the day between the USA and Germany, and we talked about it pretty extensively in yesterday's recap video, but worth mentioning again, how it worked for the US is they needed to score as many goals +2 in order to catch Canada, however many goals Canada scored in their opener, plus whatever that original 2 marker, which they were down by. And coming to the game against Germany, that number was 10 goals. And very unlikely they were going to get there. You look at this U.S. team, yes, they can score a lot, but this German squad is a pretty good team as well. And so for the U.S. today, yes, they end up taking this one 5-1, so obviously didn't get to that 10-goal margin. But now it's going to set them up for a game against the Swedes, assuming the quarterfinals go as expected, where Sweden ends up beating Latvia. I don't think that game's going to be as much of a blowout as most people might give it credit for. But for a team like the U.S., it is a very solid game today against Germany. They played pretty well. I thought that there was definitely some moments they could clean up, but you saw just how much they were able to wear down that German team. One kind of that recurring theme we saw was the battle between Matthew Tkachuk and Leon Draisaitl. I thought that was a really good part of the game for the U.S., that they were able to get into the head of their opponents. And especially when you think about this Olympic run where fights are relatively discouraged, more on that in a second, but it's very difficult for teams to be able to kind of respond the right way to players like Matthew Tkachuk, players like Brad Marchand, players like Brady Tkachuk as well, if you can throw him into that mix. And teams like the U.S., when they are as skilled as they are, if you can get in the head of your opponent, you can rattle them early and get them off their game, that's where they become so successful. And for teams like the U.S., today was a perfect representation of that. The Germans couldn't get much going. Tim Stützle was pretty quiet. Draisaitl pretty quiet as well. And then from there, you saw the point of emphasis on going north, playing north hockey, where it was all offense all the time. And I thought the U.S. did a really good job today. And for Germany, the kind of the opposite side, where they just were beat by a better team yet again today. And the Germans had their moments, they had some looks, but ultimately it came down to their best players couldn't be their best players today because of the fact that part of it was they were distracted, and part of it was the U.S. plays a very good fourth line, third line, where that line is going to shut down their opponents, especially on their top side. And so for the U.S. today, a big win, a 5-1 win, and a really impressive win at that. And as much as they don't get that 10-goal margin they were looking for, I do think that this is a game they can take away and be happy with as they move into the quarterfinal round in the playoffs, because this is the kind of game they're going to need to play if they do want to go out and beat a team like the Swedes, not necessarily as much offense, but also taking care of defensively as well. I thought the goaltending was much better today. They didn't go with Swayman, who was setting up in the rafters. I would assume that would continue throughout the rest of this tournament, but definitely something to keep an eye on there. for the US. Then on to the news we go. And we'll start here with the Swiss with a bit of an injury update. And we left yesterday's video on a bit of a question mark when it came to the injuries. We talked about, well, what was to come. Obviously, Kevin Fiala was off to the hospital. He's been released today after, I believe he's released today. If not, they released a statement basically saying that he's done for the tournament and for the rest of the NHL season. So obviously we do hope he gets better and quick. But that was more or less expected. I wouldn't say that many people had high hopes for him coming back to the tournament, especially after that scary incident against the Canadiens. But the other one that we looked at, and I think this one was a little bit more so what people had their eye on, was what was to come for a guy like Dennis Malgin. Andrea Glauser's the other one, where the Swiss weren't really sure if they'd have them for this game, and they didn't. And both those players were hurt. We'll see if they can find their way back in the lineup. It didn't sound like it'd be a long-term injury. That hasn't been what's been reported. But at the same time, we know what these nagging injuries can do, especially as tournaments progress. And for two key players to the Swiss team, you obviously are going to want them back. Guys like Sven Andrighetto play pretty well alongside guys like Dennis Malgin, and so we'll see whether or not those two can find their groove yet again. If Malgin can return for the qualifying round, a big game for the Swiss. We'll see whether or not they are able to get back in time for that, but definitely something to keep an eye on there for Switzerland. Then to the Czechs, where it's once again another good performance from them, but just not getting the results they're hoping for. And they've been a relatively disappointing team at this tournament, and not necessarily because of the way that they've been playing, but more so just with the results side. And part of it is to do with how they've been playing, but I think in many ways it comes down to them playing decent enough to get the win, but just not getting the bounces that can change the tide of the game. They make a few mistakes that end up on the sticks of their opponents, and then from there it's just very difficult to kind of keep it going. But for the Czechs, you look forward in this tournament, it's a tough road in. You got to go through the Danes, who have played some interestingly well hockey. I wouldn't say they've been great, they haven't been terrible, but they've been keeping pace with their opponents. And then, of course, you look to that quarterfinal round, assuming they get through the Danes, and it's Canada. And they've already been beaten once by Canada in a blowout type fashion. And so it's going to be tough for them to kind of rebound for that game. We'll see whether or not they can do it. But for the Czechs, it is go time for them. We'll see whether or not they are able to keep it rolling, because they have been playing pretty good hockey. They just haven't quite gotten the results. And then we'll go to the one everybody's been waiting for. And yes. Tom Wilson did get in a fight today, and you can even go back in our preview video for this Canadian team. I know I've been saying since the start that Tom Wilson doesn't really conform to the IIHF rulebook. And am I wrong? I don't think I was wrong in that claim. But you look at this game today for the Canadians. Obviously, you got a big hit on Nathan McKinnon, and then from there it becomes a bit more of a headhunting type role. Wilson takes a fight late in the game. Pierre Crinal is the other player that is involved in that fight. And I found it really interesting as well to see that Wilson kind of turtled as soon as he realized his gloves were off in the tournament he was in. And it felt like it was more that kind of knee-jerk reaction where you are so accustomed to just dropping the gloves, especially when you get into that kind of spat. But for this team, for Canada in particular, you do have to be careful with that, because sometimes, and it doesn't carry a suspension into this time, and I will say he is lucky for that, but you do that again, you do that down the line, it could become a very different animal for a guy like Tom Wilson, who is well known for his ability to fight, to cause problems, and to deliver those big hits. For teams like Canada, you have to be careful, especially like for a guy like Tom Wilson. Something to keep an eye on there as the tournament goes onwards. Our over-under line on fights or bad penalties or whatever you want to call it was at 1.5. So I would say that is likely going to become something to keep an eye on as we go into the playoff rounds. The competition gets better and more intense. Don't be surprised to see Wilson do something else that's pretty stupid on the IIHF stage. Not a big fan of the fight today, I will say. And I know it's fun and it carries headlines, but as the Canadian and as the resident Canadian, I am a little bit nervous to see what's to come for a guy like Tom Wilson at this tournament. It wouldn't surprise me after today to see him get sat on the bench, but you do need that kind of guy, and he's playing alongside top line minutes with McDavid. So I don't know if they'll be able to get him off that line now that he's been playing for so long alongside him at this tournament, but I do think that this is something that has to be cleaned up. It's the unfortunate part of his game is he's not going to be able to clean it up, and so we'll see whether or not he's able to mitigate that as this tournament goes onward. But Tom Wilson, Pierre Quinault both got into a fight today for Canada and the French. Then to Latvia with a decision. And for Latvia today, and this is one of the more complicated topics of the news section because you come in today, there's a few things to keep an eye on. In Group A, it was pretty easy. The winner of the game between Czechia and Switzerland ended up going to the second spot in Group A, loser to the third spot. For the Group C standings, it was a little bit different, and there was the potential for a three-way tie. You look at Denmark, you look at Latvia, you look at Germany as well. Assuming Germany lost to the U.S. in regulation, which they ended up doing, what that meant is there was a three-way tiebreaker. And Latvia knew this coming in, that the game between U.S. and Germany had no real implication on the final standings, unless, of course, the Germans pulled off the upset and ended up winning. So that score had no implication. As long as the U.S. won in regulation, that was all that really mattered for this three-way tiebreaker to happen. And the decision to pull your goaltender was a bit of a questionable one in my eyes, because you look at that and you say, well, and they pulled it relatively early too, I might add as well. It was about a 2:30, 2:40 mark that they pulled the goalie. And the question has to be raised is, if you're Latvia, don't you not just wait it out and see if Denmark ends up pulling their goalie? Because if Denmark pulls their goalie, because they have to, once again, to get themselves above the line for the three-way tiebreaker, then you get the opportunity to put the puck into the empty net. And so for Latvia today, I wasn't the biggest fan of them pulling the goaltender, and I thought it was a poor decision to make because they keep their goaltender in the net. They end up even losing by a goal. You see it in the final standings now that if they lose by that one singular goal, then all of a sudden it doesn't end up hurting them. And so I just think that for Latvia in this game, the decision to pull their goaltender was a bit of a poor one. And if they kept their goaltender in, you likely probably would have seen the Danes pull theirs because of how important these tiebreakers and these seeds actually are. Something to definitely have kept an eye on, because they couldn't have fallen any farther down in the standings, especially with their own goal differential for the Danes. And so they probably would have ended up pulling their goaltender, because whether or not they won by a goal or a couple more became one of the more talking points of today, because it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And so for Latvia, the decision today to pull their goaltender, I was not a huge fan of. I thought that they very much should have kept the goaltender in and forced Denmark to make a call on whether or not to pull their own goaltender. And I thought there was moments where I was thinking in this game that we very well could end up seeing that kind of fun part where sometimes both goaltenders end up getting pulled and you play without a goaltender on both sides. It could have been an interesting one there, but unfortunately today didn't quite get that. And so Latvia kind of shoots themselves in the foot at the end. And yes, you want to win those games, and I understand also the logic behind it. You want to try and get higher up in the standings, because if they ended up squeezing a point out of the Danes and finding the goal with the goaltender pulled, then all of a sudden you end up as that second seed and your path in becomes much more simple. But unfortunately for them today, could not get the job done, and they will finish last over in Group C. The Danes will get that third spot. And then to Denmark today with the hot start. And you look at this Danish team coming into this game, and they were relative underdogs. I wouldn't say they were huge underdogs by any means, but they were an underdog in this game against the Latvians. And we saw why towards the end of this game, but you look at the start of this one, and it was a near perfect start. You couldn't really ask for a much better one. And that's going to be one of the things you'll look for early on for this Danish squad is when they go up against the Czechs in their qualifying round game, can they find ways to cause problems? And they're a team that's very good at causing those problems. We saw it in their game against the US yesterday, where it wasn't necessarily the best well-played game from the Danes, and the US, I wouldn't say played well either, but they were able to kind of force the hand of the US team. And you go up against a team in the Czechs, who are a very solid team as well. You think to their previous success at all the World Championship tournaments. This Czech team is in this tournament to try and earn themselves to a medal. They're going to have a tough ride after whoever it is, whether it's the Danes, whether it's the Czechs, because they're going to have to go play Canada. But realistically, it's still going to be a game for the Danes when they're playing the Czechs or Canada that there is an upset warning written all over that one. And so for the Danes, they can continue those hot starts. They'll make their job a lot easier, and especially for some of the teams that might be sleeping early on in this one or in those games, might be a time to really kind of seize the moment and take over. Denmark today with the hot start. Then to Germany with a bit of a clear path. And you look ahead for this German squad, there's a few things to keep in mind. The first, they're going to go play France in the qualifying round. That is about as good of a matchup as you could have gotten, as of at least of what we've seen so far at this tournament. Yes, the French have played some interesting games. Yes, they've played some good moments within the games, but they've yet to play a good game through for the full 60 minutes. And so for a team like Germany, I think that this is probably the best matchup you could have asked for. And then you couple it with the fact that you have the probably the easiest quarterfinal matchup against the Slovaks. And yes, the Slovaks have been riding hot, and I can appreciate all our Slovak friends who are now marching into the comments. And please do. I always enjoy to see those comments. But what I'll say about this German team is they just had one of the easiest paths to that semifinal round and a chance to play for a medal that they could have asked for, because you don't want to play the Finns, you don't want to play Canada, and you don't want to play the US in that semifinal matchup. And so in that quarterfinal matchup. And so you get the Slovaks, and all of a sudden it becomes sunshine and rainbows for them. And we'll see whether or not they are able to keep that kind of success going into these playoff rounds that they have seen a little bit, but still haven't really found their best game yet at this tournament. Something to keep an eye on there for the German squad, with now their clear path to the medal round. And the other side of it is for the US, it was the tough path. And for this US team this year, coming into this tournament, they were the clear-cut favorites to become that top seed overall. And you look for the US to be as the top seed. It's going to help them not only avoid Sweden in the semifinals, assuming this tournament worked as it should have. It didn't, so besides the point. But if the US were to become that top seed, they would have avoided Sweden in the semis. They would have been fine, and the tournament would have made sense. You look at it now, and the second seed ends up playing, of course, the winner of Latvia and Sweden. And assuming the Swedes end up going through that, then it becomes an even tougher road to the eventual matchup that you're looking for in this tournament for the US, because you're going to have to go through the Swedes. Then most likely, assuming there's at least one other upset, you'll see the Finns become the team to keep an eye. The Finns will likely be your semifinal matchup. And then over on the gold side, you'll likely have to play Canada to get to a medal. And so you end up taking the worst possible route to the gold medal game, which, once again, we talked about it coming into this tournament. Of course, think back to 2006, the last time this tournament was held in Italy, and you had the whole debacle with the Swedes throwing their game to get an easier seed in. And for the US today, they had that opportunity. They had the opportunity to take the German route, but unfortunately today didn't quite do that. And now we start to see the ramifications of it. A tough loss or a tough win, or a win today, but now a tough schedule ahead. We'll see how this US team fares as they do now look to try and find their way through in one of the toughest roads to the medals that they probably could have gotten. We'll see for the US with their tough path, but that'll do it today for our news. We will now shift over to our final standings. From Group A, we will see Canada in first place with 9 points, Switzerland in second with 5, Czechia in third place with 4, and then France in last place with 0 points, 3 regulation losses. Over to the Chaos Group B, we have Slovakia in first place with 6 points, Finland in second place also with 6 points, and Sweden in third place once again with 6 points as well. And then Italy in the last spot in Group B with 3 regulation losses for 0 points. Over to Group C we go, where it's a little bit more of a chaos one as well, with the U.S. sitting pretty in the top spot with 9 points with 3 regulation wins. Then you have Germany in the second spot with 3 points, Denmark in the third spot also with 3 points, and then Latvia in that fourth spot with 3 points as well. The three-way tiebreakers are the reason for all of these. The goal differential ended up coming important, and for each of these teams, a very narrow margin game that ended up hurting them. And that's kind of the beauty of it. You think to those key moments, and whether it be their game for Latvia today, where they pulled their goaltender, lost because of that, whether you think even over to Group B, where that late goal from the Slovaks, which turned the tide and ended up giving them the group, some very important minor type games, minor type goals that we were talking about at the start of the tournament, especially with goal differential being as important as it was, came back to bite a lot of these teams in the butt at the end of the tournament. But as far as those final seedings go, we'll touch on it here. Canada is the number 1, the U.S. at number 2, Slovakia at number 3, all because of the positioning. First spots get 1 to 3, second spots 4 to 6, and so on and so forth. So Finland in 4th, then you have Switzerland in 5th, Germany in 6th, Sweden in 7th, Czechia in 8th, Denmark in 9th, Latvia in 10th, France in 11th, and then Italy in 12th place. All of those have to do with the goal differential as far as the points and the goal differential goes. And so once again, your final standings here, the last time you get to see it. But we will now shift over to our playoff picture. And so in our playoff picture, a few things to keep an eye on. The first is that all these teams are reseeded after the quarterfinals, so that the best placed team at the time plays the worst ranked team, and then the second and third seeds, whoever they might be, end up playing each other according to the seeds we just touched on. And so when we look at this playoff round for this tournament, there's, once again, a few things you want to keep an eye on. Your matchups for qualification round: Czechia takes on Denmark, Switzerland takes on Italy, Sweden plays Latvia, and then Germany will play France. And so for these games, there are some more blowout type games. You look to the Swiss to try and blow out Italy. Yes, the Italians have played some very good defensive hockey as of late, ignoring the game against the Finns, but realistically, you can expect that game to be a bit of a blowout. I think the Germany-France game too, you can expect to kind of be that high-scoring margin game for the Germans. They should run away with it. At the same time, this German team has played some really good games at this tournament and struggled to score, and they played some very bad games at this tournament and still struggled to score. And so we'll see whether or not that has any implication on the final game here in the qualification round for this German team. But I do think that in the end, for the Germans, they should be able to walk away with this pretty handily. I think we will see the unlocking of their offensive side. Don't expect that game to be terribly close, which then leaves us with 2 games. And the Czechs and the Danes, I think, will be a bit of an interesting one. I think that game is an underrated game where, yes, the Czechs should be better on paper. Yes, they should walk away with it. But a team like Denmark also has the pieces to pull off upsets. And they have the defensive capability. We've seen that so far at this tournament, where it's not necessarily them playing the best defense, and they're not necessarily known for their defensive side. They transition well, especially on the offensive side of the puck, but they're more so just committed to their defensive structure, and they play it well. And for teams like the Czechs, we'll see whether or not that becomes a bit of a clog in the machine. The Czechs, relatively more offensive team. Their defense are okay, not great. And so for the Danes, if they can keep it going and play like the Swiss did today, they very well could pull off an upset there. I think that slight edge does go to the Czechs, but that game should definitely be a lot closer than it really is. The other one that I have my personal eye on is between Sweden and Latvia. You look at the Swedes, and yes, coming into this tournament, kind of that clear-cut third-place team as far as rosters go. Latvia, not necessarily there. You kind of argue them around the 9th and 10th spot, depending on who you put between them and Denmark as the better team. Today, they kind of shot themselves in the foot when it came to their seeding. Once again, they pulled their goaltender, probably shouldn't have, and then followed through to the end. Unfortunately for them, a kind of a loss in that category, having to go up against the Swedes in the qualification round, and then the US in the quarterfinals, and then they'll have to go play Canada most likely in that, unless Italy or France end up winning, they have to play Canada in the semis. And then if they go on and somehow pull off 3 straight upsets against the 3 best teams at the tournament, you might end up playing the Finns for gold. So you end up going through the 4-team gauntlet, which would be a story in and of itself. Do I think it's going to happen? Probably not. But you look at this Latvian team, they're just built for an upset, and they always have and they always will be. And that's their style of game, is they're going to play good defensive hockey. They're going to cause problems for you. And for teams like the Swedes, we've seen them struggle with that a little bit already, whether it be against the Finns, whether it be even more so against the Italians, where that game got ridiculously close towards the end because the Swedes got impatient. They started making forced plays, and then the Italians came back up the other ice and found that kind of offensive stride. And so for teams like Latvia, if they can keep playing that strong defensive side, teams like the Swedes are going to get impatient. They're going to force things, and then that's how they're going to end up beating you. And so for the Swedes, you obviously want to see them win if you're a Swede, but there's also the fact that they should win this game coming to the tournament, a tough opener. And I think a lot of people, you look at kind of the teams on paper, Swedes should have been in there. They're not anymore. They've ended up coming third in their own group. The Slovaks took the top spot after a kind of a bad penalty. And now it's on the Swedes to kind of pull themselves out of that mix. We'll see whether or not they can do that kicking off against Latvia. Then you kind of look ahead, and we don't want to talk too far ahead, but this is kind of serving as a bit of a playoff preview. You look to that Canada-Czech game, or Czech-Denmark game, whoever comes out the winner, likely going to be the Czechs. That'll be a really good game as well. I know what the score was off the top, but the Czech team has been growing, becoming more consistent with their chemistry. Wouldn't surprise me to see that Czech team make an impact, especially in that game. We'll see if they end up spreading out their lines to not have just one line of offense. I think that could be definitely a major difference for them if they do end up playing against Canada in that rematch, because that one line got shut down. And then from there, it just became a tough game for the Czechs to really get anything going in. Should be one to keep an eye on for that one. Then, of course, Finland and Switzerland. That'll be a good game. I think that's the one where it could go either way as well. Wouldn't surprise me if the Swiss upset for the Finns. Those 2 teams are relatively tight in terms of skill. Yes, the Finns have a lot of NHL talent, but at the same time, the Swiss have a lot of really good European talent as well. That game, I think, could be very close. Then over to the Slovak side, of course, the group winners get the automatic bye to the quarterfinals. You look at the German-France game. Germany should come out on top in that one. Germany and Slovakia, I think, is going to be another one of those really tight quarterfinal matchups that could go either way. I think that game is going to be criminally underrated as far as the best games in the quarterfinals go. Should go either way. I think the Germans might even have a little bit of the edge in that game. But the way the Slovaks have been playing so far at this tournament, and assuming they can keep that star talent going, they will likely end up being the favorites in this one. On paper, the Germans have it, but in the actual practice, what we've seen so far at this tournament, especially with how they've played in big games, I think the Slovaks definitely have the edge, at least going into the quarterfinal round. Then, of course, the top one where you're likely going to see the U.S. taking on Sweden, unless Latvia can pull off the upset of the year and go out and beat the Swedes after a really embarrassing tournament, which would be kind of funny, but it is definitely possible. Latvia or Swedes and the U.S. would be an amazing game in the quarterfinals. Should have been and could have been a potential gold medal matchup or even a semifinal matchup. And I think that's where teams like the U.S. and the Swedes are going to come out absolutely flying, because they know the stakes of that game. They know what's at stake, especially when you take a look at the NHL versus NHL talent. It's going to be a tight game, one to keep an eye on, be one of the better quarterfinal matchups as well. But we'll bring it back now. We'll shift over to tomorrow's games, back into the qualifying round. And so we'll start here at 6:10 a.m. Eastern time between Germany and France. Going to be a bit of more of that blowout game. We touched on it a little bit already, but as far as the prediction goes for this one, I do expect the Germans to win probably by 3, 4, or 5 goals in the end. The French might get a goal going back the other way, but I think in the end, the Germans control the pace of play. They find their offensive touch, and they get some big efforts from their star talent. Then to the second game between Switzerland and Italy. This game, once again, I expect to be a bit of that more blowout side where the Swiss really rack up a lot of shots, but it's not necessarily going to be high quality. We'll see whether they're going to be able to penetrate through that trap style that this Italian team has been playing so well. They struggled earlier in the tournament against the French, but I do think that this Swiss team has found their groove, and depending on if their injured guys end up coming back, could become a very important part to how well this Swiss team will fare. I'm going to take, though, the Swiss to probably win by, once again, 3, 4, or 5 goals, depending on how they end up playing in. Then the third game of the day at 10:40 a.m. Eastern time between the Czechs and the Danes. You look to this one, I think this game is going to be a very tight game, and I think you'll look to the Czechs win by probably a goal or 2 goals in this one. I think you could see that empty net being a factor as well for this team, and the Danes have played some pretty good hockey, haven't necessarily got the results, and the Czechs, kind of the converse part of that, where they haven't played all that well. They've had some good games, but they haven't played all that well, but then it's just a matter of if they end up playing their best game, they should be able to beat the Danes. But if they continue playing what they have all tournament, that's where it could become to start going either way. I am going to take the Czechs, though, probably a tighter margin, 1 to 2 goals, maybe an empty net as well to throw in there. 10:40 a.m. between Czechia and Denmark. Then the last game of the day between Sweden and Latvia. In this game, I think it could go one of 2 ways. The first way is that Latvia shuts the door and ends up beating the Swedes in a very tight margin game, a tight checking game as well, where the score will be a little bit lower. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Latvians end up pulling off this upset. I think that, yes, the Swedes are the far better team on paper, but what we've seen so far from the Swedes at this tournament is that they've struggled with the trap-style defense. The Latvians employ that kind of system, and so it wouldn't surprise me to see them continue to struggle. But in a more realistic sense, I also could see the Swedes going completely blowing out the Latvians and making it ugly like that game was against the U.S., which I think is a little bit more that likely outcome where you're going to see the Swedes win 5-0, 6-1, 7-2, kind of in that blowout type fashion. That's the game I'm expecting. The Swedes end up winning by a margin, 3:10 p.m. Eastern time. Your games of the day for that day on the 17th is the first one between Czechia and Denmark, the other one between Latvia and Sweden. We'll see if either of those teams are going to be able to pull off the huge upset. But that will do it today for our scheduled content. We'll now switch into viewer questions. We do put out a poll on our Twitter, X, and YouTube page asking for your questions and thoughts on the day. We have 2 questions from today. We'll start here with one from Nick, the IIHF fan, who says, for Denmark-Latvia, that empty net goal ultimately switched Denmark and Latvia's seedings. If Denmark had won by just 1, they'd be the 10 and Latvia the 9 because of Group C tiebreakers. I can't imagine what Latvian fans must be thinking right now. And that's perfectly fair. And you think, we talked about it a little bit already when it came to how well that this Latvian team has played in this tournament. They've had some good games. They've had some not so good games. They upset Germany yesterday. They played an amazing game today against the Danes. And of course, the opener against the U.S., where that game was a little less pretty. But for this Latvian squad, they've been getting progressively better as this tournament's gone onwards. And so I think that as much as, yes, you're going to go up against the tough Swedish team, you kind of want to go out and play a relatively stronger opponent who is going to underestimate you because you're a smaller country, you're a smaller hockey country, you're Latvia versus the big powerhouse in the Swedes where they're going to be coming overconfident. We've already seen them struggle with some of that trap-style defense. I think that's exactly where the Latvians actually want to be as far as that first matchup goes. Do you want to then go play the U.S.? Probably not, and unfortunately for them, that's just part of it now. But this team had the potential to go very far in this tournament if they just didn't pull their goaltender today, because you see kind of what that flip version could have been, and the path in would have been a little bit easier. Unfortunately for them, end up losing that game by 2 goals. Now they have to go through Sweden and the U.S. Going to be a tough road in, but you never really know at these tournaments, and there's always a miracle sitting around the corner. So we'll see whether or not the Latvian team is going to be able to find their way through. But we will go now to the second comment from today from Michelangelo B5W, who says, with Slovakia playing Germany, France in the quarterfinals, we will have an unexpected team, at least in the bronze medal game. And that's completely fair. And even look back to those predictions where I had the big four ending up making it on to those medal games. I had the U.S. taking down Canada. I've since switched my prediction. I think Canada is now the better team that we've seen on paper, especially with the chemistry as it's grown. And the goaltending for me was a huge question mark coming in, which is why they're now the favorites as far as the final result will go. And then, of course, we had Finland beating the Swedes in that bronze medal game, which I guess we got the first part of that right. But coming to this tournament, there's the big four teams that most people kind of had in their medal games. But there were also, in my eyes, kind of those kind of sleeper teams where you had the Swiss and the Czechs, two teams that I think could very realistically compete for that gold medal. And then you also had the other side of that, where it was the teams that could compete for the bronze medal, where you had a little bit of that wider range, whether it be the Slovaks, whether it be the Germans, whether it even be Latvia or Denmark, who I think in my eyes at least kind of could have snuck into that bronze medal game with a little bit of standings luck. And so we're seeing that kind of play out now, where those standings luck is now in the present. And so with those kind of that three-way team, Slovakia, Germany, and France, we will see one of them at least playing for a medal at this tournament. And then from there, it's a matter if they can pull off that magical upset that they all need, because really it comes down to one game at these tournaments. One game with a hot goaltender can absolutely steal you a game, and who knows, maybe even a medal along the way. But be sure to come back tomorrow. We'll be doing our women's semifinal recap, as well the day after. We'll be getting to the playoffs of the men's tournament, the qualification round. Be sure to come back. We're breaking it all down. But with that, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Please drop a like. If you really consider subscribing, tell all your friends down below your thoughts on day 5 of the men's Olympic hockey event. Until next time, see ya.